Hello everybody! In today's video, we're going to be reviewing gamo2's Faucetwo Sound Voltex controller. And before we get into the review, I just have two disclaimers. One, I was sent these for free, but I am not being paid to make this video. I sure wish I was paid sometimes. Second disclaimer, I designed this. The top part here with all the drawings and stuff, I made it. Even though I made the top part of the controller, I don't know anything else about the controller. I didn't know anything about the knobs, the buttons, how the rest of the controller looked like, how the bottom or what the insides were. I just knew how the controller looked like from the top and the placements of the LEDs. But I didn't know what the LEDs did or the modes or how they worked. The original idea for the LEDs was like this, and when I saw it, I was just like, I was not paid to design this. The design is actually incomplete because I realized that if I did finish the design, it would definitely kill Yuancon. So I was like, yeah, I'm just going to not finish this. So it's kind of blank actually. It's totally not because I just looked at my computer and was like, wow, I'm not being paid enough for this and gave up. So yeah, this is the Faucetwo and let's begin the review. I was sent two controllers by gamo2. One is completely decked out with arcade knobs, Omron switches, and Sanwa buttons. The other is the cheapest option available, Chinese buttons, Honeywell switches, and gamo2's default knobs. So let's just get onto unboxing quickly. The box is typical from gamo2 at this point. Picture of the controller on the top and the logos at the side. Also, the box is really hard to open because the cover is so tight fit on the box and all the air pressure and stuff. Underneath the styrofoam there's the controller, and then under the controller we have the extras. We have two cables, a USB Type A to Type B cable and a USB Type C cable. And then we have the manual. You should be able to find a soft copy version of this on their website too if you lose this. They also give this tiny blue box of a ton of rubber dampening pads. This is for the default knobs and I'll explain what it is for later. This blue box also comes in the box even if you get the arcade knobs, which is okay, because the arcade knobs don't use these rubber dampening pads. And here's the controller. Unlike the other Sound Voltex controllers, the sides are rounded and I think it makes it look pretty cute and nice. I won't comment about the design on top of the controller though. The sides are completely blank and the underside is this translucent plastic. The front of the controller has the two ports for the cable and another arcade button in the middle. This is the function FN button for changing modes and etc. The best part about gamo2's Sound Voltex controller is that the bottom cover of the controller is always magnetic. The Faucetwo has much better design for the bottom cover compared to gamo2's older Sound Voltex controllers, the SVSE5 and the SVRE9. Because on those, the magnetic bottom cover is made of acrylic and it was really hard to remove and put back because of the shape. The default knobs on the Faucetwo uses something I've never seen on a Sound Voltex controller. These are optical encoders and they're used in 2DX turntables, except they are shrunken down to this mini size and used as Sound Voltex knobs, which is a huge surprise. I've never seen it before. If you don't know what optical encoders are, they are encoders that uses a combination of LEDs, photo sensors, and this disc with holes to determine rotation position. And because these are optical and they use LEDs and photo sensors, there are no parts touching each other. It basically means that the controller is virtually unbreakable. The only thing that will wear out is the physical turning knob, and that's why they have extra dampeners, because those will wear out over time. This is actually more genius than the arcade knobs. The arcade knobs have many touching and turning parts, all the metal parts and the white dampening ring and all that stuff, which means there are more room for breakdown between them. And this is why in the arcade, the knobs break down pretty often, like once every 3 to 5 months, depending on how rough the players are on them. I've seen and felt so many knobs break, but I've never seen a 2DX turntable encoder break before in the arcade. So by using optical encoders in a Sound Voltex knobs, they've basically created something that's almost indestructible. And the thing is, these new default knobs are different from their old default knobs. Their old default knobs were not great. The old default knobs, you can find them on the previous version, the SVSE5. Those older knobs turn into groove coaster joysticks after a while, and they have this clicking feeling like a microwave knob whenever you turn them. And everyone told anyone who wanted to buy from gamo2 to buy with their Kopal knobs instead of default knobs. As for arcade knobs, they don't have anything fancy moving in it from the insides. The really cute thing I noticed was that you can't actually fit the full arcade knobs in the controller because the controller is too short for it. But what they did was shrink down and cut down the metal brackets holding the knob encoder and parts. The encoder and parts are still exactly the same as the arcade cabinet, just that the metal bracket holding it is smaller. The controller generally looks nice, I guess. As expected, the lights from gamo2 are crazy bright, which is amazing. I love it. It looks like looking into the sun. The buttons are way brighter than Yuancon's lights. And the LED strips are crazy bright too, like equal brightness in my opinion. The only thing I don't like is how the controller uses two USB cables. But that's fine, it's okay. At the very least, they're removable now, unlike their older SVSE5. The LEDs are pretty. The top LED works a little like Virgo's turbochargers LEDs, except that the animation isn't the same, so that's kinda disappointing. Instead of shooting red and blue left and right when you turn the knobs, turning the knobs changes the direction of this rainbow thing that keeps moving. I don't understand why the rainbow slowly moves to the right even when you're not touching the knobs. It should be stagnant. I gave gamo2 feedback about this, but I don't know whether they're gonna update it or not. The side LEDs are just a static color, but they blink whenever you press any buttons. How are the default knobs compared to the arcade knobs? They're honestly amazing. I actually prefer the default knobs over the arcade knobs right now. The arcade knobs wiggle a bit and makes this sound. They're smooth, but somehow the default knobs feel smoother, and they don't need loop like Yuancon does. The default knobs also feel better than Yuancon knobs actually. They have this really nice smoothness, yet resistance at the same time. They don't wiggle at all. Yuan also doesn't wiggle, but generally these knobs are textured at the sides and the top, and they just feel wonderful. The paper-like sound the default knobs make when you turn them kinda reminds me of Kopals a little, but the paper-like sound is really quiet. Turning the default knob and the arcade knobs actually feel pretty different. So I made this chart comparing the amount of resistance between the arcade knobs and the default knobs. Because you don't need much force to turn the knobs on the default knobs or keep it turning. But for the arcade knobs, you have to use a bit more force to start turning the knob. But once the knob is moving, you don't need as much turning force to keep it moving. And now about buttons. Do you need Sanwa buttons or Chinese buttons just fine? Well, firstly, here's a sound test. Honestly, in terms of use, they feel very similar. A lot of people claim that Sanwa buttons are just an option there because it's exactly the same as arcade, they're extremely expensive, and they only make a sound difference. Well, yeah, they feel similar, but Chinese buttons always felt a little bit more loose or wobbly in terms of play for me. It makes a slight difference, but I still play exactly the same. The thing about Chinese buttons is that they are physically lighter than Sanwa buttons because, you know, they're cheaper. And because they are physically lighter than Sanwa buttons, they actually feel lighter in a way when I play because the springs can push back the buttons faster and with more force. I've used Sanwas for a long time actually, and I'm honestly okay with Chinese buttons. Even though Chinese buttons feel more wobbly and make me feel like I'm being less accurate, but I do just fine. It doesn't really affect play at all. Most people just get Sanwa for the feel and sound. I personally got Sanwa buttons because of the same reasons. They're great, but also way too expensive. Chinese buttons work just fine and they barely impact your performance at all. It's a really small difference that most people can overlook, to be honest. So in honesty, just get Chinese buttons unless you feel like going for the full arcade experience later. Alright, now about the functions of the controller. There are 3 modes in a controller. Firstly, there's the EA Cloud mode, and that's the default mode, which you can set by holding down the button combinations of Start, FXL, FXR, and BT8. It's basically a gamepad controller mode that works with the Sound Voltex e-amusement cloud. The second mode is the HID joystick mode. It's also another gamepad mode that works exactly the same way as the EA Cloud mode, but the difference is that in this mode, you can set HID lights. You can access this mode by pressing down Start, FXL, FXR, and BTB. The last mode is HID keyboard and mouse mode. This mode turns all the buttons into keyboard inputs and the knobs into mouse axis movements, similar to what Yuancon has on default, and gamo2's older Sound Voltex models. You can access it by holding down Start, FXL, FXR, and BTC. For each mode, just remember that you have to hold down the button combination for 3 seconds and wait for all the buttons to flash before the mode switch is successful. To show your current mode, press down Start in both FXs. The corresponding BTA, B, or C button will light up to show your current mode. Another interesting thing is that you can change the trigger distance of the knobs. But what is trigger distance? Trigger distance is a little like dead zone of the knobs. It's the distance of how much you've turned the knob before it activates and turns. The arcade knobs on my arcade have a pretty high trigger distance because it's been so worn out that the dead zone is pretty huge. So for the Faucetwo, you can change the trigger distance level based on what you're used to or what's most accurate for you. In total, there are 6 trigger distance levels. Level 1 being the smallest trigger distance, where you turn very little before the knob activates, and level 6 being the highest trigger distance, where you have to turn a lot before the knob activates. You can reduce the trigger distance by holding down FN and FXL to reduce it, and then FN and FXR to increase it. The top LED indicates the trigger level, and here they are. For me, I used level 2 for the default knobs and the same for the arcade knobs. Honestly, it really doesn't matter. I think I might have swapped them to the smallest trigger distance because I think me and my friends figured that it was the closest to what we will use on arcade. Now for the light combinations. You can change the left LEDs by holding down Start, BTA, and FXL and turning the left knob. You can do the same for the right LEDs by holding down the reverse, Start, BTD, FXR, and turning the right knob. You can turn on or turn off all the lights by holding down Start and all the BTs. And there are no other modes for the lights. You can't change the top LEDs at all, which kinda sucks. You can't change the speed of the rainbow moving or change the colors or make it like Virgo Turbocharger's animation pattern. It'd be nice if there were other animations and trigger modes where any of the LEDs, like the LEDs at the side or top flashes when you touch the knobs or the buttons. Another interesting thing between the default knobs and arcade knobs that I noticed was that the default knobs are easy to turn. And because they are easy to turn, the top LED kind of flashes and turns into white when you make any small amount of turn. So it looks like on the default knobs, the lights turn a lot faster and it's kind of seizure inducing compared to the arcade knobs. I don't know why it's like this and I wish I could change the speed of how much the lights move because of that. The default knobs use these dampeners to keep the turning smoothness. Now for knob maintenance, we are finally going to talk about the knob dampeners. So the default knobs use these dampeners to keep the turning smoothness. When I first received the controllers, the knobs were actually too loose. They spun too easily. To increase the tightness, I had to add in another dampener. The thing is that the default knobs came with 3 dampeners in them. I told gamo2 about the loose issue and that changing it to 4 layers instead of 3 made it lighter and closer to arcade. And they responded to me saying that they will be now shipping the controllers with 4 layers instead of 3 from now on. So now for maintenance. To add or remove or replace the knob dampeners, first remove the back cover of the controller. Remove the 2 wires connected to the encoder and please remember which wire goes where because if you swap them, you'll swap the directions of your inputs. Then remove the nuts holding the bottom of the knob in place. gamo2 doesn't provide any tools like a nut remover or an Allen key, so maintenance is a pain in the ass if you don't have the tools, which I didn't. Then unscrew these 2 screws and remove the knob with an Allen key. You can now add, remove or replace the dampeners. Then repeat all the steps before in reverse to put the knob back in place. It's really hard to do any maintenance without the proper tools, so I find it pretty annoying that they don't provide any of the tools to do that. And now, for gameplay. The controller works perfectly actually. Sometimes I even felt like the controller knobs were way more sensitive than what I was normally used to, but that can be adjusted with the trigger sensitivity and the in-game knob sensitivity. I also tested the controller on Eterna and it looks like I think it runs at 1000 Hz. I'm not the most proficient 4K player, so I can't test it as reliably, but I also tested it on an input testing program. And from the looks of it, none of the inputs are affected of anything, which means that is 1000 Hz. As you can see from the numbers here, the numbers are super delayed because the buttons are big and deep unlike keyboard switches. So that's why there's so much delay. But for chord splitting, I noticed that the controller splits at 4 milliseconds, which means that if you were doing the last part of Jabara, pressing all the 4 BT buttons at once, the difference between the first and last hit is 12 milliseconds. So this is something to note. If you're doing a lot of chords, it's better to hit earlier. So yeah, the controller works great for Sound Voltex and definitely an option to consider honestly. Now for the configurations and the price. gamo2 currently offers these configurations and prices. So for the complete default option, it's about 169 USD. If you choose the Omron switches, the price is about 199 USD. The arcade specifications are not open or out right now, so we'll have to wait for gamo2 to update our website with them. So by the way, should you get Omron switches? Omron switches is what the arcade cabinets use, so I highly recommend you choose Omron switches instead of Honeywell switches. I haven't played with the Honeywell switches to know enough about them, so I highly recommend that you go for the Omron switches instead because that's what the arcade uses and it's not too expensive compared to straight out going with Sanwas. So now the conclusion. Honestly, this controller absolutely floored me. The build of this is way better than anything I've seen so far. The case, the feet, the backing, the insides and the knobs are very professionally made. It practically blows the rest of the competition out of the water because every other controller feels a little homemade in comparison now. This is definitely a Yuan Kong killer actually because of the very competitive price and the fact that the knobs work very well, and even better than Yuan's. Yuan's knobs has a constant mouse movement for their knobs, and that's not actually how knobs are supposed to work. They're meant to move as much as the speed of you turning the knobs, not at a constant speed. And that kind of thing fucked me up a little when I got used to Yuan's knobs and then went to the arcade. However, if you're a full knob turn player, Yuan's knobs won't bother you at all. But the thing is that gamo2's knobs work right. Their default knobs, they feel great and they won't break down. The other good thing is that the controller is very light. You can lift this up with one hand no problem, which is great if you need to move the controller from your shelf to your desk and whatnot. The only downside I see in this controller right now is the fact that it needs 2 USB ports, and that maybe if you're the kind like me to like stuffing your controllers with cloth so that it will stop the vibration sounds and to make it quieter, you can't do that with the default knobs because you'll cover the discs and basically stop it from working. And the other thing is, well, the design. I don't like this design that much. Mostly because this design is based on Sound Voltex Vivid Wave. It's already outdated. Exit gear is out. So this design, this theme is outdated. So that's something to consider. Other than that, this controller is great. I really like it. I'm starting to use this controller over my SVRE9, and that's something to say. And I actually like using this over the arcade knobs, which is also something else to say. All in all, I highly recommend this controller over other competitors right now because of the price and the build. And that's all I have to say about it. That's it. Here's some gameplay. I cleared it! Ah! I did it! I did it! Oh, okay, I think I can try clearing Buffer Fighters. Nice! Thanks for watching.